What if Zeus, the king of the gods and god of the sky, was dropped into modern times? He'd be in for a bit of a culture shock, that's for sure. First off, he'd be bombarded with images of people on their phones. And being the all-knowing god that he is, he'd know exactly what those tiny little glowing rectangles were. He'd probably have a lot of questions about why people are staring at those phones so much. And then there's the fashion. Oh man, the fashion! He'd see all these scantily clad women and think to himself, hey, is this heaven? But then he'd realize that no, this is actually hell. Because in ancient Greece, the hottest place in the afterlife was reserved for those who had disrespected the gods. And Zeus would be very upset about that. But maybe, just maybe, he could use his godly powers to fix it. You know, like maybe he could turn all the phones into iPhones or something. That would definitely make him a lot more popular. Poseidon, god of the sea, has arrived in modern times. But there's a problem. He doesn't know how to use his powers. Back in ancient Greece, he was known for his immense strength and power over the seas. But now the ocean is polluted and the fish are all dead. So he goes to the beach to see what's up. And wouldn't you know it, he sees a mermaid. Now, back in his day, mermaids were a rare sight. And to be honest, they haven't really changed much. They're still pretty rare, but this one's different. She's not just any mermaid, she's a pop star. And she uses her powers to control the weather, the tides, and of course the waves. Poseidon is blown away by her power, but he's even more blown away when she crashes into him with a giant wave and knocks him out cold. The last thing he sees before he blacks out is her face. And it's not a face that he's seen before, it's the face of an angel. Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty, was just dropped into the middle of Times Square. Aphrodite, where am I? What is this place? Why does everyone here seem so ugly? Suddenly a hot guy walks by and Aphrodite's like, whoa, he's kind of cute. I haven't seen a guy that attractive since Adam. Aphrodite then gets a full body scan with the latest AI technology. The results, 92% human, 8% AI Aphrodite. So I take it you humans are all about that artificial life. You know, in my day, we didn't have all this technology. We used to have to walk everywhere. It was so much harder to get around. She then checks out the menu at a nearby cafe. Everything's like $5 more expensive than it used to be. Back in my day, we didn't have all this crazy expensive food. You could get a whole meal for like 2 pieces of bread and a pouch of wine. Aphrodite. Ugh, I'm so over this place. It's so loud, and there's garbage everywhere. I'm gonna go back to Greece. What if Ares, the god of war, was transported into modern times? He'd be a billionaire, obviously, because Ares is the god of war, not peace. He'd have all the money in the world. No one would want to go to war. And with his godly powers, he could manipulate people into doing what he wants. But what would he do? What if Ares became obsessed with TikTok? He'd post videos of him slaying monsters and winning battles, garnering billions of views and becoming the most popular god of all time. But then he'd get bored of that and move on to bigger and better things like starting a war. With the snap of his fingers, he'd have armies at his command, taking over countries and spreading chaos and destruction everywhere. And we'd all be at his mercy, unless of course we could defeat him in battle and take his power away. But who would be brave enough to do that? Who do you think would win in a fight? Zeus or Apollo? Let me rephrase that. Who do you think would win in a fight if Apollo was transported into modern times and had to fight Zeus in his godly form? So we all know Apollo is the god of music, light, and healing. He's also one of the most powerful Olympians. So imagine if he was dropped into the middle of Times Square, right? In front of the bright lights of New York City, he would be blinded and deafened by the sheer volume of sensory input. Then imagine him trying to hail a cab. He'd probably get run over. Then he'd go to a coffee shop and order a coffee and be like, can I get a latte with oat milk? And the barista would be like, we don't have any oat milk, sorry. And then Apollo would be like, well, then just make it a cappuccino. And the barista would be like, sorry, we're closed. And Apollo would be like, wait, what? It's not even 8 a.m. yet. And then the barista would just roll their eyes and be like, dude, it's 5 a.m. You're in New York City, we're closed. And Apollo would be like, what? And then he would just give up and go back to Greece because New York City is too hard for him. What if the god Dionysus was transported to modern times? So we all know Dionysus is the god of wine and festivity. He's known for starting the most epic parties in the ancient Greek world. But what would he do if he was dropped into today's world? Well, first things first, he would obviously be very confused by everything that's going on. The buildings are too tall. The cars are moving way too fast. And why is everyone staring at their phones? But then he would see a bar and think, finally some normalcy. And then the bartender would ask him what he wants to drink. And he would say, surprise, I'm the god of wine, make me something strong. And then after a few drinks, he would start to relax and enjoy the modern conveniences that we have today, like Uber. So he would get into an Uber and say, take me to the nearest party. And then when he got there, he would be like, wait, where are the grapes? Why is there no wine? And then someone would hand him a phone and say, here, just order it on Uber Eats. The Olympians, if they were dropped off in modern times, part 2, Zeus would be absolutely useless. He'd spend all his time playing with the newfangled flying machines called drones. Oh, and he'd be too busy ogling the clouds to notice Hera, his wife, being worshipped by a cult of screaming teenage girls. Poseidon would be pretty stoked to see the ocean for the first time in thousands of years. He'd also be the one to teach everyone the art of surfing. Hades would be in charge of the underworld, you know, the realm of the dead. He'd be so busy working on his tan that he'd forget he was supposed to be dead. Athena would be the only one smart enough to figure out how to use a smartphone. She'd spend her time tweeting about how much smarter she is than everyone else. Apollo would be a famous musician. He'd have a bunch of adoring fans, and he'd be really good at making music videos. Artemis would be a badass huntress, but she'd also be really lonely. She'd have no one to hunt with except maybe Aphrodite, who would be too busy taking selfies to notice. Ares would be a terrible war correspondent, but he'd be really good at making explosions. Aphrodite would be a social media influencer. She'd spend her days taking selfies and her nights crying in her mansion. Hermes would be a delivery guy. He'd be really good at his job, but he'd also be really bored. Hephaestus would be a blacksmith. He'd be really good at his job, but he'd also be really lonely. Hestia would be a stay-at-home mom, but she'd also be really depressed. Dionysus would be a party animal. He'd be really fun at parties, but he'd also be really irresponsible. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, was just dropped into modern times. She's been here for 5 minutes, and so far she's seen a lot of things, but nothing quite like this. When the Uber driver asked her where she wanted to go, she thought for a moment. I haven't decided yet. Take me somewhere nice, you know, with good food and maybe some wine. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror and said, you look familiar. Have we met? Possibly, she said with a smile. I've lived many lives, but I don't remember much about her. Do you feel like you're having a midlife crisis? Because this is your sign to stop whatever you're doing and take a break. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. I feel like I'm forgetting something important. What do you think, Zeus? Should I go to therapy? He put his arm around her shoulder. Of course you should. But first, let's get you a drink. You look thirsty. She laughed and took a sip. This is so embarrassing. I haven't felt this out of place since the last time I tried to use a dating app. What if Hermes, the messenger of the gods, was transported to modern times? He'd be in charge of delivering messages from the gods to humans, which would be pretty easy. Like, hey, Zeus wants to know why you haven't paid your taxes. Or, Poseidon is angry that you stole his trident and used it to stir your latte. But Hermes would also be in charge of bringing offerings to the gods, which would be a lot harder. Like, what do you even offer to a god in the year 2023? The options are pretty slim. You could give them the new iPhone, but they already have one of those. You could offer them a Tesla, but they don't need that either. I mean, they're a god. They have all the money in the world. So the only thing left to offer them is your firstborn son. And hey, at least you get one of these bad boys in return. Ra, the Egyptian sun god, is brought to modern times. Ra was a big deal in ancient Egypt. He was like the Elvis Presley of his day. So when he's brought to modern times, he's expecting to be greeted as a rock star. But nobody cares about Ra. Nobody even knows who he is. He walks down the street and people just ignore him. They're too busy on their phones. He tries to hail a cab, but the driver just tells him to walk because there's traffic. And then Ra gets hit by a car. But all of this is just a plot device to get Ra to open up the Egyptian Museum of Natural History. Because at the end of the day, Ra is all about that light. And what better way to get some rays than by opening up a museum full of mummies? I mean, come on, it's a win-win situation. The mummies get to rest in peace, and Ra gets to be the coolest god of the Nile. Well, technically, he's not a god anymore. He's just a dude, but you know what I mean. Time travel to meet Prime Salim and Anarkali. It's the year 2023 and these two Mughal emperors are not happy. They just came from the future. They're not from around here. Salim, played by Shah Rukh Khan, is dressed in a golden gown and a wig. And Anarkali, played by Kareena Kapoor, is stunning in a red lehenga. But they're both very confused by what they see around them. First, they try to hail a cab, but the driver doesn't understand what they're saying. So Salim jumps in and drives off. Then they go to a restaurant and order some food. But when it arrives, they're horrified to see that it's all mixed together. Where's the fun in that? Next, they hit up a popular tourist spot, but they can't take their eyes off their phones. So they ask a local to take a picture of them, but he takes the phone and runs away. Finally, they decide to get some ice cream, and as they're walking, they see a huge billboard of Shah Rukh Khan's face, and they both scream, "What?" Because they know that's him, but it's not them. It's just a really big coincidence.